is called Rhetorical Situations and Their Constituents. And it works off of the first reading that we had for week 2, Rhetorical Situations and Their Constituents by Keith Grant-Davie. So I would advise you read that article first. Go ahead and make some annotations and some important points that you found from that article, and then come back and watch this video. Because this video will actually talk about some key important parts that Grant-Davie makes. So we'll start off with part 1, exigence and rhetors. So what is a rhetorical situation? Grant-Davie actually cites three people that talk about the rhetorical situation and give 3 distinct definitions that build off of one another, but also can be seen as their own separate rights. So the first one is by Bitzer. And Bitzer is cited all throughout Grant-Davie's article. It's actually the main person that he works off of. But Bitzer says, a rhetorical situation is a situation where a speaker or writer sees a need to change reality and sees that the change may be effected through rhetorical discourse. So for Bitzer, a rhetorical situation is something that is found in reality, something that is a problem, something that needs to be solved. So the speaker or writer, or even rhetor, is the one that finds a problem and he sees that it can be solved or changed or just affected through discourse, or in other words, conversation. But Vatz has a little bit of a different definition, and this is found in the second point here. Vatz says that situations do not exist without rhetors, and that rhetors create rather than discover rhetorical situations. Later on, he says rhetors not only answer the questions, they also ask it. So here, Vatz is working a little bit differently than Bitzer. Bitzer says that a rhetorical situation is a situation where a speaker or writer sees a need to change reality. Therefore, what he's trying to say is that there is a problem, and the writer is there to try to help, not necessarily fix it, but start a conversation about how we can go about fixing it. Vatz says that we as rhetors and writers actually create the problem rather than just discover it. So, there may not be a problem at hand or a visible problem, but we as rhetors and writers, it's our responsibility to say, like, hey, there's something going on here, and draw the attention to it, and therefore we create the problem, and we answer our own questions or through discourse or writing. So there we go. Writers not only answer the questions, they also ask it. So not only do we discover, like Bitzer says, but we also ask or create, like Vatz says. And the third person that Grant-Davie cites is Consigny. And what Consigny says is the art of rhetoric should involve integrity, the ability to apply a standard set of strategies effectively to any situation the rhetor may face. Rhetoric should also involve receptivity, the ability to respond to the conditions and demands of individual situations. So when we begin with integrity, the ability to apply a standard set of strategies effectively to any situation the writer may face, what Consigny is saying here is that any rhetorical move, any situation, I know maybe some of you know this as, ethos, pathos, logos. You should be able to apply that to all rhetorical situations, is what Consigny is arguing here. And then the second point that he makes, receptivity, is that the ability to respond to the conditions and demands of individual situations. What he's trying to say is that we as discourse makers, we as writers, we as rhetors should be able to respond to every rhetorical situation with the strategies that we have in place, and also be able to meet the demands of other individuals within that situation. So Grant-Davie takes all 3 definitions into account, and he says rhetorical situation as a set of related factors whose interactions creates and controls a discourse. And later on, he actually says that that is actually a very, very broad way to define what a rhetorical situation is, taking into account what all other previous scholars have said. And then this is why he decides to make this article, is because rhetorical situation is a very broad area, and that we need to define it a little bit more closely. And just to keep in mind, discourse, when we say discourse, we mean a conversation, communication, or debate. So when we think about the discourse in your projects, in your community projects, we think about what conversation is my project starting? What type of conversation am I entering in with this project? And then, of course, a rhetorical situation is, just to narrow it down a little bit here, is why the project was created to do what? For who? To start what discourse? How will you do it? So there's a lot of questions that take place in the rhetorical situation, as you can see from these multiple scholars and Grant-Davie trying to encompass all of these different conversations into one definition. So understanding the parts, this is where Grant-Davie wants to narrow down what we consider the rhetorical situation and be a little bit more explicit with its definition. So to understand the rhetorical situation, he says that we need to understand the constituents of situation. And what constituents are, in other words, it means like accomplices or parts of. So understanding the parts of the situation. So he works from Bitzer, and he says Bitzer has three main parts that encompass a rhetorical situation: exigence, audience, and constraints. So Grant-Davie takes these three main points from Bitzer, and he's looking to expand Bitzer's definition of these three to really better understand and define more structurally rhetorical situations and how we come to know them and how we define them. So the first one is exigence, which will be the majority of this part one. So exigence, Bitzer says, rhetorical exigence as the rhetor sense that a situation both calls for discourse and might be resolved by discourse. So the rhetorical situation, whatever conversation your project has, it calls for a conversation, and it might be solved through conversation. So essentially, why is the discourse needed? Why is this project needed? What is the exigence? When we think about exigence, we think about the importance, the ultimate end. What is the end to your means is what we think about when we think about exigence. So Grant-Davie then expands off of Bitzer, and he says what the discourse is about, why is it needed, and what it should accomplish. So he moves past it. He moves past just understanding what is the discourse about. So what is your project about? He starts talking about, okay, why is it needed, and what should it accomplish? So first, he understands that the subject exists, right? What is the discourse about? The second part is why is it needed? So it's identifying the source and its consequences. So what are the consequences to starting this discourse? Where is it coming from? And I want to add to here, examining the importance and the value. So why is this discourse important? Why is your project important or valuable? And then the third, what it should accomplish. So what should be done about it? You know, what is the outcome? What are the end goals of your project? So if we start off with what is the discourse about, Grant-Davie takes us a little bit deeper in understanding the discourse at face value. So he talks about, what values are at stake, what fundamental issues are represented by the topic of discourse, what fundamental issues are represented by your projects. What is the underlying value or idea you are trying to discuss? So this third point is actually really important and something that I want to see you do in your own papers as well for your rhetorical analysis. So an example that Grant-Davie says is, a speech on the topic of requiring school uniforms in public schools may engage the larger issue of how much states should be free from federal intervention. So although, let's say, your project may be about creating an infographic of why schools should be allowed to require school uniforms, and you make this infographic explaining all the ways why public schools should be able to make the decision of whether or not they want to include school uniforms as part of their rules, as part of their structure for their schools. Although that may be the initial or the face value discourse or importance of that conversation, largely you are actually talking also about the bigger issue of how states should be free from having federal government intervene or tell state schools how to run. So that would be your larger exigence. So you have almost like a primary exigence, the problem at hand, but then that problem at hand actually may raise larger issues that we really should start thinking about. So what is the underlying value or idea you're trying to discuss? The underlying value here would be to be free from federal intervention. The primary value would be that state schools should be allowed to require uniforms if they so choose. And that would be the fundamental issue that's being presented in the topic of discourse. The second point is, why is the discourse needed? So Grant-Davie goes into what he calls kairos. Kairos is a really great term. It explains why something is needed right now. It's about timeliness. So why is now the right time to start talking about this, that school uniforms should be allowed to be determined by states? Why is now the right and appropriate time? Why does the discourse matter? That goes again with the time. Why does it matter at this time? And Grant-Davie says why the issues are important and why the questions it raises really need to be resolved. So these are questions that I want you to ask about your own project. Why are these issues actually important to not only the community partner, but also possibly their clients and the Boston area at large? Why is it that these questions need to be raised, and why do they need to be resolved? For the community partner again, for their clients, and then largely for the Boston area. Additionally, exigence doesn't have to be because something has happened, but it can be for something that will happen or for something that might happen if it's not addressed. This is actually a really brilliant move that Grant-Davie says. So exigence doesn't have to be a response to something. We don't have to have an exigence because something has already happened. However, we can have an exigence, or we can start a conversation or develop our project because we are afraid of something that might happen or something that will happen if we don't go ahead and address it. So one example that I think of that comes to mind is we just had Pride Month, which was the month of June, right? And so why do corporations and companies all put out rainbow flags, which is the gay pride flag, during the month of June only, but then put them away for the rest of the year? So something hasn't happened yet, but in order for corporations to look as if they are inclusive, as if they are accepting, they know that they will have to put out the pride flag at least for the month of June, so that they won't be seen as a corporation who isn't accepting of queer individuals, right? So this is just something to think about too when you're developing your project. Maybe something hasn't happened yet, but what will happen if your project isn't developed? What might happen if you don't start the conversation in your project? And then exigence, what is the discourse trying to accomplish, right? So what do you want your project to do? The conversation in your project that you're starting, what is it trying to do? What are the goals of the discourse? How is the audience supported to react? And then you have primary and secondary objectives, right? For your discourse. For community, this goes again back to the underlying values and ideas. So you have fundamental values, right? That we talked about, which were school uniforms, being able to be enforced in state schools, and then the underlying value is just having federal intervention away from these state schools. And so here we see a second type of way to put it. It's primary and secondary objectives. So for community partners, perhaps your primary objective is to create a space folks can gather to prevent loneliness in older community members. That's for little brothers, right? The secondary objective is to promote the importance of intergenerational conversations and talking across differences to find similarities. So primary and secondary objectives is, it's a little bit different, but it's similar to your fundamental and underlying values. Here, however, we see maybe like an order of things, a hierarchy of importance. So you have the primary objective, which is to just converse with people who are older members of the community. The secondary objective is to make sure that these intergenerational conversations are happening because we're able to find some differences or some similarities in differences. And then finally we come to rhetors, which is you, the writer, the creator, the composer. Rhetors need to consider who they are in a particular situation and be aware that their identity may vary from situation to situation. So what Grant-Davie is saying here is that we ourselves as composers, as writers, as rhetors, need to really consider who we are in association to this project, who we are in association to this community, who we are in association to this conversation. What identities do we have? Because we all have multiple identities. We all have multiple experiences that tie us to these projects. What are the experiences? What are the things that drew you to the project that you are working on? You all applied to this project. You all wrote a cover letter. You all thought and made connections to these projects. So who are you? What is your identity? How does your identity fold or fit into these projects, into this conversation, into the duties that you have to do for these projects? So who are you? Because we hold several identities. What is your relationship to the project, to the conversation, to the community? What is at stake for you? This one is a little bit a hard one. So what is at stake for you? I know that some of us may say that what's at stake for me is my grade because I need to do well. Yes, that of course is at stake for you. But think a little bit deeper. What are you, and you might not realize it right now. Maybe that's something that you realize later on as you are finishing up your project. You realize, maybe I do have a larger stake in this than I imagined. But start really thinking about, as you're gathering research, as you're talking with your community partner, what is really at stake for you besides, getting a grade in the class? And of course, as a rhetor, sometimes you don't speak alone. So when you develop your projects, it's not just going to be from, Bobby. It's not just going to be from Sally. You're going to be a representative of a larger organization or community. And that's going to be the same type of perception that you have to have whenever you develop documents or writing for your careers later on. So although you are the lone person that is writing or composing or creating something, you actually are a stand-in and a representative of a larger organization or company. When you work with these community partners, you are a larger representative of my classroom, of me. You are an extension of me, and me and how I teach. Even larger, you are a representative of Northeastern. You're a student, so you are representing Northeastern through these community partner relationships. When you're doing something for the community partner, you are a representative of that organization because you are doing something for them and you are writing and composing and creating with them and for them. So keep in mind that a rhetor isn't just only you, that you may be representative of something bigger. Grant-Davie says, like exigence, then audience can influence the identity of the rhetor. So thinking again about your audience, who your audience is, who you're writing to, can actually really influence who you write as, what type of identity you decide to hold when writing as. I'm going to give the example of someone in the classroom. I'm not going to give their name, but they were talking to me about how they had a grandmother who they spent a lot of time with. They would always go to her nursing home, would do many things for her, and he felt that connection, so he decided to apply for the Little Brothers program, the community project. And so that identity of being a grandchild was something that they took on when they decided to write their cover letter. It wasn't the identity of whatever their major was, what their profession was, or who they wished to be, or it wasn't even the identity of a Northeastern student, but it was the identity of a grandchild, of someone who has that type of relationship and saw that connection with that community partner and wrote in that identity because their audience, Little Brothers, would have appreciated that. So your exigence can very much be influenced by your audience and who you are as a rhetor. Like who you are as a rhetor, your audience is going to influence that. It's going to influence how you write and who you write to. Grant-Davie also says new rhetorical situations change us and can lead us to add new roles to our repertoire. So anytime we come across a new rhetorical situation or a new project, they will always change us. Every conversation is not the same. As well as every conversation doesn't require the same identities, right? So we take our strategies from situation to situation. We also have the capability to adapt to new situations and are not limited in those same strategies. So to take the first part, new rhetorical situations change us, so we are able to change with each problem that we're presented with each project that we are given. We can actually use those same strategies from one rhetorical situation to the next one. We are able to change in that way. We're able to use the tools that we have to change from project to project. However, that doesn't mean that we're only firm or stand firm in only one way of knowing, or only are set to one set of tools, right? We also have the capability to adapt to new situations and are not limited in those same strategies. So we're actually able to add more tools in our toolbox. We're able to change our identity if we need to. If I need to write as the grandchild in order to really influence my audience, then I'm going to write as a grandchild. However, if I need to write as a Northeastern technical profession writer for my professor for this assignment, then that's how I'm going to write. So we have the capability to adapt to new situations, and we're not limited to those same strategies. Strategies that I use to write a rhetorical analysis is not going to be the same strategy that I use to write a resume, right? Strategies that I use to write my resume are not going to be the same strategies that I use to write a final report. There are that I will be using some strategies from each. Of course, strategies will cross over. We totally expect that to happen. But that doesn't mean I'm only limited to those certain sets of strategies. I have to think about my identity as a rhetor. I have to think about the situation. What does the situation want for me? I have to think about the audience. I have to think about the end goal. These are all things that you think of as a writer, as a composer, and that I would like you to start thinking about as you're writing your rhetorical analysis as well. You really need to start thinking about who you are and what the exigence is. What is this project's main goal? What is the conversation they're trying to start? And that's the end of part 1. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. But part 2, we'll talk about audience.